I was not born a soldier. Before the war, my world was quiet and ordinary. I studied history at university. I walked to class with books pressed against my chest. I argued about the past, never imagining I would soon become part of it. I learned to shoot not because I loved weapons, but because discipline fascinated me. Precision, focus, control. I joined a local shooting club believing it would remain a hobby, something distant from real violence. Then Germany invaded. The sound of war reached us before the truth did. Rumors came first, then trains full of wounded men, then the lists of the dead. By the time the reality became impossible to deny, it was already too late to remain untouched. The Nazis were not coming to negotiate. They were coming to destroy. When I volunteered for the Red Army, the officer looked at me and laughed. He pointed toward the nurses' tents and told me I would be more useful there. I refused. I asked for a rifle. They hesitated. Then they tested me. I hit every target. Silence replaced doubt. Training was brutal. The rifle became an extension of my body. I learned patience before speed, breathing before movement. A sniper does not rush. A sniper waits. My first battlefield was Odessa. The ground was soaked with blood before I ever fired a shot. Men screamed. Artillery shook the earth. Fear crawled into every thought. Then I saw him, a German soldier, unaware, standing in the open. My finger tightened. The shot was clean. He fell. I did not celebrate. I did not cry. I understood something instantly. This war would never let me return to who I had been. From that moment on, the battlefield became my classroom. Every shot taught me something new, about distance, about wind, about death. The Germans learned quickly. They sent their best snipers to hunt me. I hunted them back. Each duel was a test of nerves, hours without movement, muscles burning. One mistake meant death. I survived. Again. And again. By the time Odessa fell, my name was already being whispered among soldiers. Some spoke it with pride, others with fear. I didn't listen. I only counted. When Odessa was evacuated, I moved to Sevastopol. The fighting there was worse. The Nazis attacked relentlessly, determined to break us. They failed. One winter morning, after hours of waiting, I eliminated 3 enemy soldiers in less than a minute. My spotter whispered my name like a prayer. I felt nothing. The numbers kept rising. Not because I enjoyed killing, but because if I didn't, they would. By the end of my frontline service, I had confirmed 309 kills. Each one carried weight. Each one stayed with me. And the war was far from over. By the time Odessa fell, I no longer counted days. I counted shots. The battlefield did not care who I had been before the war. It stripped names, pasts, and futures away, until only survival remained. When we were ordered to withdraw to Sevastopol, the retreat felt less like escape and more like preparation for something worse. Sevastopol was different. Odessa had been chaos, movement, noise, constant motion. Sevastopol was a siege. Time slowed. The air felt heavy, as if even breathing required permission. This was where snipers truly belonged. The Germans understood that too. They sent their best marksmen to break us. Men trained specifically to hunt people like me. They didn't fire wildly. They waited. They studied. They watched for the smallest mistake. So did I. A sniper duel is not a fight of strength. It is a fight of patience. Hours passed without movement. Muscles cramped. Insects crawled across my skin. I ignored them all. Blinking could kill you. Breathing too deeply could reveal you. Fear had to be pushed somewhere far away. My spotter whispered warnings, distances, wind shifts, shadows moving unnaturally. Then silence again. The first duel lasted nearly 4 hours. I detected a glint, barely visible, almost imaginary. I waited longer, forcing myself not to rush. When I fired, the German sniper never knew I had seen him. After that, they came faster. 2 at once, then 3, sometimes changing positions deliberately to confuse me. They used decoys, corpses, helmets on sticks. I learned to wait longer, to trust instinct more than training manuals. One afternoon, I realized I was being watched from behind. I rolled just as a bullet struck the earth where my head had been moments before. Dirt filled my mouth. My heart pounded, but my hands were steady. I crawled for hours before taking my next shot. That sniper never fired again. The numbers kept rising, not because I sought them, but because each enemy sniper removed meant fewer dead soldiers on our side, fewer wounded carried back to tents that already overflowed. I told myself that repeatedly. Still, the nights were not kind. Faces appeared when I closed my eyes. Not the Germans, my comrades. Men who laughed hours before dying. Boys who pretended not to be afraid. The Germans adapted. They brought artillery to flush us out. Entire sections of forest were obliterated because they suspected one sniper lay hidden there. Sometimes they were right. Sometimes they weren't. Sevastopol burned. Shells fell day and night. Buildings collapsed into themselves. Smoke never fully cleared. Food grew scarce. Sleep became a luxury. One morning, after a successful engagement, a young soldier approached me quietly. He asked how I lived with it, how I carried the weight of killing. I didn't answer immediately. Then I told him the truth. I don't carry it. I survive it. The command began using me differently. I was ordered to train new snipers, men and women barely old enough to shave. I taught them how to disappear, how to wait, how to control fear before it controlled them. Some listened. Some didn't live long enough to learn. During one battle, a mortar explosion knocked me unconscious. When I woke, my ears rang violently. Blood ran down my neck. A medic dragged me into cover while shells continued to fall. I returned to position 2 days later, because stopping felt worse than pain. The Germans tried to break morale by spreading rumors, claiming they had killed me, that I was gone, finished. I let them believe it. Then I took 5 more shots. By now, my reputation moved faster than I did. Soldiers whispered my name. German prisoners spoke it with anger. Fear shifted sides. That scared me more than anything else, because legends stop being human, and humans break. In June 1942, a sniper duel nearly ended everything. The German sniper was patient, disciplined, and intelligent. He waited nearly an entire day without firing. So did I. At dusk, when exhaustion dulled the edges of awareness, he made his move. I fired first. The relief was brief. A shell exploded nearby moments later, throwing me violently into the earth. Shrapnel tore into my face. Pain blinded me. When I woke in a field hospital, I knew immediately something had changed. The ringing in my ears didn't stop. Doctors told me the truth, gently. My frontline service was over. I had survived, but the war wasn't finished with me yet. When the doctors told me I would not return to the front, I did not argue. I already knew. The ringing in my ears was constant now, a sharp, endless sound that never faded, even in sleep. It followed every thought, every breath, a reminder that something inside me had been damaged beyond repair. The battlefield had finally taken its price. Being removed from combat felt like a punishment I hadn't prepared for. I had survived shells, sniper duels, hunger, and exhaustion, but surviving peace inside a hospital tent felt harder. Others were still fighting. I wasn't. The command reassigned me almost immediately. If I could no longer fire a rifle, they would use my voice, my experience, my reputation. I was ordered to train snipers across multiple units, young men and women who looked at me with a mix of awe and fear. They knew the number. Everyone did. 309. They expected wisdom, secrets, something that would make them invincible. I gave them truth instead. I told them fear never disappears. I told them patience matters more than skill. I told them that every shot changes you, whether you admit it or not. Some listened carefully. Some smiled, convinced they would be different. Many never came back. As the war dragged on, my role shifted again. Soviet command decided my story could be useful beyond the battlefield. Germany painted its enemies as weak, divided, afraid. A woman sniper with hundreds of confirmed kills destroyed that image. So they sent me away from the war I still dreamed about every night. In 1942, I was sent to the United States as part of a diplomatic delegation. It felt unreal, moving from bombed cities to clean streets, from rationed bread to full tables. People stared. Some doubted. At one press conference, a man asked me whether Soviet women wore makeup while fighting. I looked at him and said calmly, "I have killed 309 fascist invaders. Don't you think you've hidden behind my back long enough?" The room fell silent. America listened after that. I spoke about the war as it was, not as propaganda, not as slogans, but as reality. I spoke about trenches filled with bodies, about young soldiers who never returned home, about what happens when fascism is allowed to grow unchecked. Eleanor Roosevelt listened too. She didn't treat me like a symbol. She treated me like a person. We talked often about fear, about responsibility, about what happens after wars end. She understood something many others didn't, that surviving war doesn't mean surviving yourself. When I returned to the Soviet Union, the war was nearing its end, but it wasn't over. Cities were still burning, men were still dying. I returned to training roles again, advising, teaching, preparing others for fights I could no longer join. And every time a rifle cracked in the distance, part of me flinched. Victory finally came in 1945. People celebrated in the streets, flags waved, songs filled the air. The war that had consumed everything was finally over. I stood among the crowds and felt nothing. The silence afterwards was heavier than any bombardment. The numbers followed me everywhere. Reporters, officers, strangers. They wanted to know how it felt to be the deadliest woman in the war. I never knew how to answer, because numbers don't tell you about the waiting. They don't tell you about the cold. They don't tell you about the faces you never forget. After the war, I returned to my studies, history again. I wrote, I taught, I tried to live a life that didn't involve watching through a scope. Some days were easier, some nights weren't. The war stayed with me, not as noise or fire, but as memory, quiet, persistent, unavoidable. I had survived the battlefield, but the battlefield never truly left me. When the war ended, the world expected me to celebrate. Victory was loud. Streets filled with banners, music, and speeches about sacrifice and triumph. People smiled at strangers. They hugged soldiers they had never met. History had turned a page, and everyone wanted to believe the next one would be clean. I wanted to believe it too. But peace felt unfamiliar, dangerous in its own way. During the war, every decision had been clear. You survived or you didn't. You shot or you were shot. There was no room for doubt. After the war, doubt lived everywhere. I returned to a life that looked normal from the outside. Classrooms instead of trenches, books instead of rifles, quiet instead of explosions. People spoke about the future as if the past could be left behind without consequence. I learned quickly that war does not end when treaties are signed. It ends when memory allows it to. For me, memory refused. The state celebrated me as a hero. Ceremonies, speeches, medals, each one placed carefully, respectfully, as if they could explain what I had done, what I had survived. They called me a symbol of Soviet strength, proof that women could fight just as fiercely as men, proof that fascism could be defeated by discipline and will. They weren't wrong, but they weren't complete. Because symbols do not wake in the night soaked in sweat. Symbols do not flinch at sudden sounds. Symbols do not count ghosts instead of sheep. I was expected to speak about courage. I wanted to speak about cost. Instead, I stayed quiet. I finished my studies, history again. It felt like returning to something familiar, but the past I studied now felt close enough to touch. I taught students who knew the war only through textbooks and victory speeches. Sometimes they asked about the number, 309. I never corrected them. I never added context. Numbers make people comfortable. They turn violence into something measurable, distant. They never ask what it feels like to wait for hours, knowing you will end someone's life if they move an inch. At night, I remembered the waiting most of all. The cold ground, the insects crawling over my skin, the sound of my own breathing. I remembered the young soldiers who looked at me like I had answers for everything. I didn't. Years passed. The world rebuilt itself. Cities rose where rubble once lay. Children grew up without knowing the sound of artillery. New threats replaced old ones. My name faded. And I allowed it. I never needed fame. I had never fought for recognition. I had fought because there was no other choice. When journalists came asking for interviews, I declined. When historians reached out, I gave short answers. The story I believed was larger than me. But sometimes silence becomes another kind of lie. As I grew older, I began to understand that my story mattered, not because of the kills, but because of the choice. The choice to stand when standing was dangerous, to act when silence would have been safer. Women wrote to me, young women, soldiers, students. They asked how I found the courage to fight. I told them the truth. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that fear will not decide for you. The war had made me something I never intended to become. A soldier, a killer, a symbol. But underneath all of that, I was still the same person who once believed history was something that happened to other people. I had learned otherwise. History is written by those who are forced to choose, and choose anyway. By the end of my life, the world had changed again. The Cold War reshaped alliances. New generations learned about World War II as something distant, almost unreal. But sometimes, when people spoke my name, they did so with understanding rather than curiosity. That was enough. Because the truth was never about how many enemies I killed. It was about how much of myself I lost, and what I chose to rebuild. Time changes everything, except memory. As the years passed, I learned that survival does not mean freedom. It simply means continuation. The war no longer demanded my body, but it still occupied my thoughts. Not violently, not loudly, but persistently. I lived a quieter life after that, teaching, writing, reading, speaking only when it felt necessary. The world moved forward with remarkable speed. New conflicts replaced old ones, new enemies were named, new heroes were celebrated. And slowly, World War II became history. Students asked questions that felt distant from the reality I had known. They spoke of strategy, politics, alliances, clean concepts, neatly arranged on paper. I answered them carefully, always aware that no explanation could ever fully translate what it meant to lie motionless for hours, knowing you would kill if you succeeded, or die if you failed. Sometimes when I walked alone, the past returned uninvited, a sound, a smell, a sudden stillness. I had learned to recognize these moments and let them pass. Fighting memory only strengthens it. I had stopped counting years since the war ended. Time became something softer, less urgent. People occasionally recognized my name. Some approached with reverence, others with curiosity. Few understood that the person they imagined no longer existed, if she ever had. I was never fearless. I was never exceptional. I was simply someone who did not look away when history demanded attention. That realization brought peace. In my later years, I thought often about the young woman I had been before the war, the student who believed history was something you studied, not something you survived. I wondered what she would think of the person I became. I think she would be surprised, but not ashamed, because the war did not define me by how many I killed, but by how much I endured, by what I chose not to become afterward. I never glorified violence. I never celebrated death. If anything, the war taught me the value of restraint, of choosing humanity when destruction feels justified. That lesson mattered more than any medal. When I died, there were no gun salutes, no battlefield, no urgency, just quiet. The kind of quiet that once felt unfamiliar, but now felt earned. And yet, my story did not end, because stories like mine are never about individuals alone. They are about choices made under impossible pressure, about women who stepped into roles they were never expected to fill and performed them with discipline, intelligence, and resolve. I was one of many. Women who flew night missions with engines cut, women who carried messages through occupied cities, women who fought, healed, resisted, and survived. History did not always record their names, but it recorded their impact. If my story remains, let it be remembered not as a tale of death, but of responsibility, not of hatred, but of resistance, not of numbers, but of consequence. Because war tests more than strength. It tests identity. And what survives after the war, what you choose to rebuild, is the truest measure of who you are.